Samantha stood outside the towering wrought iron gates of the mansion, feeling a strange mixture of awe and unease. The estate loomed before her, an enormous palace of luxury, bathed in the soft glow of 1,000 twinkling lights. The driveway seemed endless, lined with pristine hedges, and the air was thick with the sweet scent of blooming jasmine, carried gently on the cool autumn breeze. She could hear the distant hum of music, a low, steady beat that echoed through the open windows of the mansion, mixing with the clink of glasses and soft laughter from the well-dressed guests already inside. She adjusted her black dress, a simple but neat uniform with a crisp white apron, tugging nervously at the hem as if the gesture might somehow settle the gnawing feeling in her stomach. Samantha had worked at high-end events before, catering to the rich and powerful, but this particular party felt different. More extravagant, yes, but also strangely personal, like she didn't just belong here as a server, but like some invisible thread connected her to the place itself. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, crossing through the gates and up the long stone pathway leading to the mansion's grand entrance. The doors were open, welcoming in guests, and as she passed through the archway, the sheer grandeur of the interior hit her like a wave. Marble floors gleamed under the glow of towering crystal chandeliers, and the walls were adorned with gold accents in ornate moldings that must have been hand-carved decades ago. But despite the luxury, something in the air felt off. It wasn't just the lavishness of the place that set Samantha on edge. It was the strange sense of familiarity, though she couldn't place why. She had never been in a place like this before, yet there was something about the house that tugged at a long-buried memory, a faint echo from her past. Her job was simple: serve drinks, offer hors d'oeuvres, and blend into the background. The elite didn't want to notice the staff at these events, and that suited Samantha just fine. She kept her head down, balancing a silver tray laden with flutes of champagne as she weaved her way through the sea of well-dressed guests. Men in tailored tuxedos, women in designer gowns dripping with diamonds. These were the people who had more wealth than she could ever imagine. It was a world that seemed so far removed from her own, and yet the feeling that something connected her to it wouldn't leave. As she moved through the ballroom, trying to stay focused on her task, her eyes wandered to the walls, decorated with grand portraits, landscape paintings, and photographs. The family that owned the mansion clearly had generations of wealth, their lineage proudly displayed in every room. Samantha couldn't help but be drawn to the frames, studying the faces of those captured in time. And then she saw it. It was in the middle of a long hallway, tucked between larger, more prominent portraits. Yet somehow it stood out more than any of the others. A small black frame containing a picture of a little girl. Samantha's breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembled, and the tray she was holding swayed slightly. It wasn't just any picture. It was her, a photograph of herself as a child. The familiar face stared back at her, wide-eyed and innocent, with messy pigtails and a shy smile. It was a picture she hadn't seen in years, one that she thought had been lost when she left the orphanage. There was no mistaking it. This was her childhood photo. But how? How could it possibly be here, in this mansion, a place she had never been? Her pulse quickened, and the questions came flooding in, fast and furious, each one hitting her harder than the last. How could this photograph, a piece of her past, be hanging in the hallway of a mansion she didn't recognize? Who had put it there? And why? She looked around, her heart pounding, half expecting someone to step forward and explain the bizarre coincidence. But the guests carried on, oblivious to the storm of confusion and fear swirling inside her. She was invisible to them, just another faceless servant in a sea of luxury. Desperate for answers, she stepped closer to the photo, her breath shallow. Her fingers hovered just inches from the black frame, itching to touch the glass as if doing so might confirm its reality. A dozen fragmented memories from her childhood raced through her mind, flashes of moments long buried. She had grown up in foster care after her parents' death. Had they known someone connected to this mansion? Had she lived here as a child before everything went wrong? But none of it made sense. She couldn't remember anything, no matter how hard she tried to piece together the blurry fragments of her past. The sound of footsteps jolted her from her thoughts. A sharp voice called her name, pulling her back into the present. "Samantha, are you all right?" It was one of the senior staff, a stern woman with a no-nonsense attitude. She was watching her closely, and Samantha quickly stepped away from the photo, her face flushing with embarrassment. "I'm fine," Samantha replied quickly, forcing a smile. "Just lost track of time." The woman narrowed her eyes but said nothing, nodding curtly before turning on her heel and walking away. Samantha exhaled, her heart still racing, and glanced back at the black-framed photograph one last time. It was undeniable. Her childhood picture was there, hanging in plain sight. But why? As she continued with her shift, trying to focus on her work, she couldn't shake the eerie feeling that had settled deep inside her. The rest of the night passed in a blur, but Samantha was no longer just a server at this opulent party. She was a woman on the brink of uncovering a mystery tied to her past, one that would unravel secrets she had never imagined, secrets that had been waiting for her in this mansion all along. The photo wasn't just a coincidence, it was a clue, and Samantha knew she couldn't leave the mansion tonight without getting to the bottom of it. Before continuing, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. This really helps a lot and allows us to keep bringing you more amazing content. Your support makes all the difference to us. Now let's continue. Samantha's heart raced as she stood before the photograph again, her fingers hovering near the edge of the black frame. The soft glow of the hallway lamps cast shadows across the walls, and the once bustling mansion had quieted down. The sounds of laughter and music from the party faded into the background, replaced by the steady ticking of a nearby clock. It was well past midnight, and the mansion had taken on an eerie stillness, as if the house itself was holding its breath. She had tried to focus on her work, forcing herself to smile and serve champagne with steady hands, but the image of her childhood face hanging in that hallway clung to her like a heavy fog. Every tray she carried, every guest she passed, was just a distraction, a flimsy barrier between her and the growing storm of confusion swirling inside her mind. She felt like a spectator in her own body, moving through the motions of her job, but consumed by a deeper, gnawing anxiety. When her shift finally ended, she wasted no time returning to the hallway. The room had cleared out, leaving only a few stray guests wandering in the distance. Her steps echoed on the marble floor as she approached the photograph again. Her breath hitched in her throat as she stared at it, her face from years ago staring back at her. The girl in the picture couldn't have been older than 5. Her hair was pulled into messy pigtails, and her eyes were wide and bright, full of innocence. Samantha could remember the day the photo was taken. Though she had been so young, it was one of the few memories from her childhood that remained vivid. The photograph had been taken during her time at the orphanage, before she was adopted by a kind but distant couple who never spoke of her past. After her adoption, everything before that seemed to disappear, as though her life had been reset. She had never seen the photo again, until tonight. But why was it here in this mansion? Samantha's mind raced with unanswered questions. She didn't know the owners of this place. At least, she thought she didn't. Yet here, in the heart of their luxurious home, was a piece of her history, framed and on display. Was it just a coincidence? Or was there something more? Her hands shook slightly as she reached out to touch the frame, her fingers brushing against the cool glass. There had to be an explanation. She couldn't let this go, but who would know the truth? The family that owned the mansion was a mystery to her, and she had barely seen the hosts all night. She glanced around, making sure she was still alone. Her mind churned, considering the possibilities. Could her biological parents have some connection to this house? Were they wealthy? The thought sent a strange jolt through her. Her adoption file had never mentioned anything about her parents' backgrounds, and she had never pressed for more information. She had simply assumed her birth parents had been like everyone else who ended up giving their children away. Ordinary, struggling, perhaps even desperate. But this mansion, this grandeur, it didn't fit with the image of her past that she had constructed in her mind. Samantha's head swirled with doubt. For years, she had pushed her childhood memories deep down, focusing instead on building a new life, working hard to support herself. She had never let herself think too much about where she came from, because it hurt too much. But now, standing in this hallway, face to face with a piece of her lost childhood, she realized that her past was still very much alive, and it wasn't done with her yet. A voice suddenly interrupted her thoughts. "Samantha, are you still here?" She jumped, her heart nearly leaping out of her chest. It was Lucy, one of the other waitstaff, a kind but nosy woman who had taken Samantha under her wing. She had a motherly air about her and was always offering unsolicited advice. "Yeah, I just got distracted," Samantha said quickly, taking a step back from the photograph, trying to sound casual. She didn't want to draw attention to what she had found. "Not yet." Lucy raised an eyebrow, her sharp eyes darting between Samantha and the black-framed photo. "You all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Samantha forced a smile, though it felt like a grimace. "I'm fine. Just tired, I guess." "Well, don't stay too long," Lucy said with a wink. "This place gives me the creeps at night. Too big and too quiet, if you ask me." Samantha nodded, her heart still racing, and watched as Lucy walked away, her footsteps fading into the distance. As soon as she was gone, Samantha turned back to the photo. She needed answers, and there was only one way to get them. She would have to ask someone in the house. But who? The owners were an elusive family, known for their wealth but rarely seen in public. Her eyes landed on a nearby door at the end of the hallway, one that she hadn't noticed before. It was slightly ajar and a faint light spilled from the crack. Samantha felt a pull toward it, a strange sense that the answers she was seeking were just beyond that door. She hesitated for a moment, her rational mind screaming at her to leave it alone. She was just a waitress after all. She had no business snooping around a mansion she didn't belong to. But the need for answers outweighed her fear. She took a deep breath and quietly made her way to the door. The soft hum of voices reached her ears as she approached, and she could hear the unmistakable sound of a man and woman talking in hushed tones. She pressed her ear to the door, straining to catch the conversation. "I told you it was a bad idea to hang that picture here," the man's voice said, frustration clear in his tone. "She'll recognize it. It's too risky." The woman's voice responded, softer but no less intense. "We couldn't hide it forever. She was bound to see it one day. It's better she finds out now, don't you think?" Samantha's heart pounded. They were talking about her, about the photograph. But who were they? And what did they mean? She'll find out. Before she could think it through, the door creaked open slightly, and Samantha's breath caught in her throat. She froze, terrified of being caught. But the voices inside continued, oblivious to her presence. "We have to tell her the truth," the woman said, her voice tight with emotion. "She deserves to know." "I'm not sure she's ready," the man replied, "but we can't keep this a secret much longer. Not with her working here." Samantha felt the floor tilt beneath her. The world was spinning, and nothing made sense anymore. Her photo in this house, their cryptic conversation, everything was connected, and she had to know why. Summoning every ounce of courage, Samantha pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The truth, whatever it was waiting for her just beyond the threshold. Samantha's knees felt weak, her pulse thudding in her ears as Mrs. Whitmore's words sank in. She grasped the back of a nearby chair to steady herself, her heart pounding in her chest. The daughter of the original owners? Born in this house? Her mind raced, trying to process the revelation. I don't understand," Samantha stammered. Her voice was barely audible, choked by the confusion swirling through her. "How could I have been born here? Why don't I remember any of this?" Mrs. Whitmore's eyes softened with sympathy, but her voice carried a heavy weight. "There's a lot you don't remember, child. A lot that was kept from you, for reasons I can't entirely explain myself. But you deserve to know, now that the past is catching up." Samantha could hardly breathe. The opulent halls of the mansion, which had seemed so foreign just hours ago, now pulsed with a strange familiarity. Memories, faint, fleeting, danced at the edges of her mind, like distant echoes she couldn't quite grasp. She could almost picture herself as a child, running through these same halls, her laughter ringing against the marble floors. She shook her head, trying to make sense of it all. Why was I put in an orphanage? What happened to my parents? Mrs. Whitmore glanced around nervously, as if the walls themselves might be listening. She lowered her voice even further, her tone full of sorrow. "It's a complicated story, dear, and not one that has an easy answer. Your parents, they were wonderful people, but something went terribly wrong, and their deaths were never fully explained. Some said it was an accident, Others whispered darker things, things about the relatives who took over the estate. Samantha's stomach churned. She had always assumed her biological parents had simply been unable to care for her, that they had made the heartbreaking decision to give her up. But now, the truth seemed far more sinister. "What do you mean, darker things?" she pressed, her voice shaky but determined. Mrs. Whitmore hesitated, clearly reluctant to go further. She cast another glance down the empty hallway before finally speaking again. "After your parents died, their deaths were ruled as an accident, some sort of fire, though the details never quite made sense. You were just a baby at the time, too young to remember. After they passed, the mansion and everything in it was left to your father's cousin, a man named Richard." Samantha felt a chill creep up her spine at the mention of the name. "Richard?" she repeated, feeling the weight of it settle uncomfortably in her chest. "Is he still here?" Mrs. Whitmore nodded solemnly. "He owns the estate now, along with his wife, Evelyn. They've been living here ever since. But they never told you the truth about who you really are. They had you placed in an orphanage, far away from here, to erase any trace of your connection to the family." Samantha's hands trembled, her mind reeling with disbelief. "Why would they do that? Why didn't they raise me themselves?" Mrs. Whitmore's face darkened, a shadow passing over her kind features. "Because they wanted the estate for themselves. You were the rightful heir, Samantha. But with you out of the picture, there was no one to challenge their claim. They took everything that was supposed to be yours and made sure you never knew." The air around Samantha felt thick, suffocating. She could barely comprehend what she was hearing. The mansion, her family's fortune, her identity, it had all been stolen from her. And the people who had done it were living in luxury while she had grown up in foster care, struggling just to survive. Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them away, her emotions swinging wildly between shock, anger, and heartbreak. "So they just sent me away? Like I didn't matter?" Mrs. Whitmore reached out, gently placing a hand on Samantha's arm. "You mattered. You mattered so much to your parents. But they were taken from you before they could protect you. Richard and Evelyn, they were ruthless. They saw an opportunity, and they took it. But you were never supposed to find out. They thought they had buried the past for good." Samantha took a deep breath, her mind racing. She had to confront Richard and Evelyn. She had to get the truth from them directly. But how could she face them after learning this? How could she walk into their luxurious home, knowing they had lied to her, stolen from her? Her pulse quickened, the fire of determination rising within her. Where are they now? Richard and Evelyn? Mrs. Whitmore glanced toward the grand staircase that led up to the second floor. They're upstairs, likely in the study. But Samantha... She hesitated, her expression conflicted. Be careful. They aren't the kind of people who take kindly to being confronted. They have powerful connections, and they won't let go of this estate easily. Samantha nodded, her resolve hardening. I don't care. I deserve the truth. They owe me that much. Without another word, she turned and headed for the stairs. Every step felt heavy, the weight of her newfound knowledge pressing down on her. Her mind raced with a million questions. About her parents, about the life she should have had, about what Richard and Evelyn had done to erase her from the family's history. When she reached the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before her, lined with more lavish paintings and artifacts that now felt like stolen relics of her past. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and power, now felt like a gilded cage, built on lies and deceit. She found the study at the end of the hall, its heavy wooden doors slightly ajar. The sound of muffled voices drifted through the crack, Richard and Evelyn speaking in low tones. Samantha's heart raced as she approached, her pulse thrumming in her ears. She couldn't turn back now. She had to confront them. She had to hear the truth from their own lips. Samantha's heart pounded as she walked away from her confrontation with Richard and Evelyn. Their cold, dismissive attitudes had only fueled the fire burning inside her. She had spent her entire life thinking she was unwanted, that she didn't belong anywhere. But now she knew the truth. The life she had been denied, the wealth and privilege she never knew she had been stolen from her. Her childhood memories, foggy and fragmented, were starting to clear. And the mansion, her birthright, felt less like a foreign place and more like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Determined not to leave without answers, she sought out Mrs. Whitmore again. The housekeeper had given her the first piece of the puzzle, but Samantha knew there was more to uncover. Samantha found her in one of the quieter wings of the mansion, tidying up a seldom-used sitting room. The smell of lavender polish hung in the air, mingling with the musty scent of old furniture. Mrs. Whitmore looked up as Samantha entered, her expression guarded. She had been kind, but there was something in her eyes, something she wasn't telling Samantha. "I need to know more," Samantha said, her voice firmer than before. "You said my parents died under mysterious circumstances. What did you mean by that? What happened to them?" Mrs. Whitmore hesitated, her hands wringing the edge of the cleaning cloth she held. "It's not an easy story, Samantha," she said softly. "Your parents, they were good people, but they made powerful enemies." Samantha took a seat on an old velvet chair, her eyes fixed on the housekeeper. "Enemies? Who? What happened to them?" With a heavy sigh, Mrs. Whitmore set the cloth down and sat across from her. "Your father, Jonathan, was a successful businessman, but he was also a man of principle. He refused to make deals with people who operated in the shadows. Your mother, Eleanor, was the same. She was generous, giving back to the community, supporting causes that made the wrong kinds of people uncomfortable." Samantha felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't known much about her parents, but hearing this made her feel an overwhelming sense of pride and sorrow. Mrs. Whitmore continued, her voice growing quieter. "Your father's cousin, Richard, was always envious. He never had the same success. He was never quite as well liked. After your parents died..." Samantha leaned in. "After they died, what?" Mrs. Whitmore's eyes grew misty. "After they died, Richard moved quickly. He claimed the estate and had you sent away to an orphanage. He told the authorities it was in your best interest, that you were too young to inherit such wealth. But in truth, he wanted it for himself." Samantha's stomach churned. "But why didn't anyone stop him? Surely there were people who knew what was happening." "There were," Mrs. Whitmore said, nodding. "But Richard was smart. He used legal loopholes, powerful connections, and, when necessary, threats. Those who might have spoken out were silenced, one way or another." Samantha felt a surge of anger. "And you? Why didn't you say anything?" The question seemed to wound Mrs. Whitmore deeply. Her face crumpled as she looked down at her hands. "I wanted to, dear, but I was afraid. I had my own family to think about. And Richard, he was ruthless. I'm ashamed to admit it, but I was too scared to act." Samantha felt a bitter taste in her mouth. She had spent years working in the service industry, feeling invisible and insignificant, while Richard had lived off the wealth her parents had built, manipulating everyone around him. She couldn't let him get away with it any longer. "I understand," she said, trying to push down her anger. "But I need your help now. There has to be proof, something that shows what really happened." Mrs. Whitmore hesitated again, but finally she nodded. "There's something I've kept all these years. I wasn't brave enough to use it before, but I think it's time." She stood up and motioned for Samantha to follow her. Together, they wound their way through the mansion's corridors, passing through rooms filled with priceless art and antique furniture. Samantha's mind whirled with a mix of emotions: grief for the parents she never got to know, rage at the injustice done to her, and a fierce determination to set things right. Mrs. Whitmore led her down to the mansion's basement, a place Samantha hadn't ventured before. The air was cool and smelled of damp stone. The walls were lined with old cabinets and boxes, relics from the past that had been left to gather dust. Mrs. Whitmore walked with purpose, her steps echoing in the stillness. At the far end of the basement, she stopped in front of an old wooden chest. The lock was rusted, and the wood had darkened with age. Mrs. Whitmore knelt down and, with trembling hands, opened the chest. Inside were a collection of papers, photographs, and what looked like an old journal. "These are your father's documents," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I've kept them hidden all these years. I was too afraid to destroy them, but too scared to show them to anyone. They contain everything: letters, legal papers, contracts that prove Richard's deception." Samantha's hands shook as she picked up the journal, its pages yellowed with time. The first entry was dated just weeks before her parents' deaths. "I fear for my family's safety," her father had written. "There are forces at work I do not fully understand, but I know they are dangerous. I've uncovered a scheme that could ruin everything I've built, and I fear Richard is involved. If anything happens to me or Eleanor, I pray that whoever finds this will understand the truth." Samantha's breath caught in her throat as she read the words. Her father had known. He had suspected Richard's betrayal long before it happened. She flipped through more pages, finding letters between her father and his lawyer, discussing plans to change his will, plans that were never executed, likely due to his untimely death. There were also letters from Richard, full of veiled threats and bitter accusations, painting a clear picture of the rivalry between the two men. "This is it," Samantha said, her voice shaking with emotion. "This is the proof I need." Mrs. Whitmore nodded solemnly. "But be careful, Samantha. Richard won't go down without a fight. He's dangerous, and he'll do whatever it takes to hold on to what he's stolen." Samantha's mind raced. She had to act quickly before Richard could catch wind of what she had discovered. Armed with her father's documents, she knew she had a chance to take back everything that was rightfully hers. But it wouldn't be easy. Richard had built his empire on lies, and he wouldn't let it crumble without a battle. As she and Mrs. Whitmore ascended the basement stairs, Samantha's resolve solidified. She was no longer just a waitress, no longer the forgotten orphan cast aside by those who sought to erase her. She was Jonathan and Eleanor's daughter, the rightful heir to their legacy, and she was ready to fight for it. The legal battle to reclaim her family's estate had begun, but Samantha quickly realized that this wasn't just about the mansion or the fortune. It was about reclaiming her identity, her legacy, and the truth that had been buried for far too long. The morning after her revelation in the basement, Samantha sat at a large oak desk in what was once her father's study. The air in the room was thick with the scent of old books, leather-bound volumes filling the shelves from floor to ceiling. A large window allowed the morning light to stream in, casting a warm glow across the room. Spread out before her were the documents Mrs. Whitmore had kept hidden all these years: letters, contracts, and the journal. These papers were the key to everything. She had spent hours going over the material, making sure she understood every detail. There were letters that proved her father had been in the process of changing his will, contracts that showed Richard had diverted funds from the family estate, and even evidence of deals that Richard had struck with shady business partners. With every page she turned, the betrayal felt deeper, cutting her to her core. Samantha wasn't a lawyer, but she wasn't alone in this fight. After a sleepless night, she had called an old friend from her waitressing days, Rebecca, a woman who had once been a corporate lawyer before leaving the high-pressure world behind to run a small legal advice clinic. Rebecca had come to the mansion immediately, stunned by Samantha's story, but eager to help. As they pored over the documents together, Samantha felt a sense of hope. "We've got enough here to take Richard down," Rebecca had said confidently, her fingers tracing the signature lines of fraudulent contracts. "But it's not going to be easy. He's well-connected, and he's not going to roll over without a fight." Samantha nodded. "I don't expect it to be easy, but I'm not backing down. Not anymore." Rebecca smiled, her admiration clear. "Good. Because this is going to be the fight of your life." Over the next few days, Samantha's world transformed. Lawyers were contacted, cases were filed, and the distant relatives who had profited off her family's wealth were served with legal notices. The mansion, once a place of confusion and fear, became her battleground. Richard and the other relatives, Evelyn in particular, tried to stonewall her at every turn. They called in their own lawyers, men who were as ruthless and cunning as Richard himself. But Samantha was relentless. For every move they made, she countered, pushing back harder. Rumors began to swirl in high society circles. The once quiet waitress, who had blended into the background at lavish parties, was now the center of attention. People whispered about the girl who had returned to claim what was hers, the woman who had risen from nothing to take back her family's fortune. Some supported her, admiring her courage. Others, tied too closely to Richard and his influence, sought to undermine her efforts, spreading lies about her motives. But Samantha had no time for rumors or gossip. She was laser-focused, driven by a need that went beyond wealth or status. This was about justice, for her parents, for the life she had lost, and for the legacy that had been stolen from her. As the legal battle raged on, Samantha also turned her attention to the mansion itself. Slowly but surely, she began to make changes, restoring the home to what it had once been. She hired a team of renovators, instructed them to carefully repair the damaged parts of the estate that had been neglected under Richard's ownership. The mansion, which had once felt cold and hostile, began to transform. Samantha reclaimed room after room, filling them with memories of her own. The first major change she made was in the grand hallway, the same hallway where she had first seen her childhood photograph. The black-framed photo that had haunted her was gone, removed the day after Mrs. Whitmore's revelation. In its place now hung a large, restored portrait of her parents, Jonathan and Eleanor, standing together on the steps of the mansion, looking every bit the loving couple she had imagined them to be. Their faces, full of warmth and kindness, watched over the house once more. But the hallway wasn't complete without one more addition. Beside her parents' portrait, Samantha had commissioned a new photograph. It was simple but powerful. A picture of herself standing in front of the mansion's grand entrance, no longer the confused and lost waitress, but the rightful heir to the estate. With each passing day, Samantha felt a weight lift off her shoulders. It wasn't just about winning the legal battle anymore. It was about reclaiming her sense of self. For so long, she had felt like she was adrift, a woman without a past, without a clear direction. But now she knew who she was. She was Samantha Edwards, the daughter of Jonathan and Eleanor Edwards. And this mansion, this legacy, was hers. However, the battle wasn't without its dark moments. Richard had always been a schemer, and he wasn't about to lose everything without a fight. He tried to undermine her case, filing counterclaims and spreading false rumors to tarnish her reputation. He claimed she was just after money, that she had manipulated her way into the mansion under false pretenses. There were moments when Samantha felt overwhelmed, moments when she wondered if it was all too much. But every time she felt doubt creep in, she thought of her parents. She thought of the sacrifices they had made, of the life they had envisioned for her, and that was enough to keep her going. One night, after a particularly grueling day in court, Samantha found herself in the mansion's library. The room was one of the few that had remained untouched by the renovations. The scent of old leather and parchment filled the air, and the dim light of the fireplace cast shadows on the walls. She pulled one of her father's journals from the shelf, running her fingers over the worn cover. She opened the journal to a random page and read, "No matter what happens, I want Samantha to know that she is loved, that everything I've done for her future. This house, this legacy, it's not just about wealth, it's about family. It's about the values we hold dear, and I hope one day she'll understand that." Tears filled Samantha's eyes as she closed the journal. She hadn't just inherited a mansion or a fortune. She had inherited her parents' dreams, their hopes for a future filled with love and purpose, and she was determined to honor that legacy, no matter what it took. The final blow to Richard came months later, when a judge ruled in Samantha's favor. The court recognized the fraud and deception Richard had employed to take control of the estate, and all of his claims were dismissed. The mansion, the wealth, and the family name were officially restored to Samantha. As she stood on the steps of the mansion, looking out at the sprawling grounds that stretched before her, Samantha felt a sense of peace wash over her. The fight was over, but her journey was just beginning. She had reclaimed her life, her legacy, and her place in the world. And now, with the support of those who truly cared for her, Mrs. Whitmore, Rebecca, and the few staff members who had remained loyal, she was ready to build a future that honored her parents' memory. The mansion was no longer just a symbol of wealth or power. It was home, and Samantha knew that from this moment on, she would never again be lost. She had found herself, and she had found her purpose, and that was worth more than any fortune. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what you thought about the story and share any themes or ideas you'd like to hear in future stories. Your feedback means the world to me. Thanks for watching.